don't sleep on Anthony Weiner. The comeback is on. I saw something the
come
other
on.
day where he was
I
talking
would
about
not sleep on Anthony
getting back
Weiner.
in.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Tuesday, February 25th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So, gentlemen, let's start with Ukraine. President Trump met with the president of France on Monday to discuss the 3-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. And also on Monday, the U.S. voted for a UN resolution in the Security Council that did not blame Russia for starting the war, and also opposed one in the larger General Assembly that did blame Russia. So Russia refuted Trump's claim that Putin had agreed to European peacekeepers in Ukraine. Carl, what do you make of what's going on in this sort of fast-moving story?
Yeah, I'm waiting for the UN resolution that Poland started World War II. Look, these comments that have come out of the White House, that have come starting with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, then J.D. Vance, even some from Marco Rubio, and mostly from President Trump himself, have really upset Europe and upset Ukraine. And the things that the president said are simply inaccurate. There's the opposite of what really happened there. And everyone knows that. But I guess what is if they manage to get a peace deal, if they manage to end this war on terms that preserve Ukraine as a sovereign nation and that Ukrainian people are willing to live with, I think all of this will be forgotten.
Tom, what do you make of it?
I agree. I mean, there was some hand-wringing yesterday about the fact, the United States is taking Putin's side and all of that. And again, I think this is acknowledging, certain realities on the ground and trying to forge a peace deal that, instead of sort of virtue signaling and voting symbolically and everyone can feel good about it. I think the Trump administration is trying to actually get something done here. And to Carl's point, if they do, and it's a lasting peace, and then it could be a win for everybody. If they don't, though, then I think people will look back and say, well, these were the mistakes that were made. And they might point to the vote in the UN yesterday as one of those mistakes along the way. But we simply can't know and won't know until we get to the point where they're either going to get something done or they're not.
Yeah, there is the longer game here, which I think is important. And that's what bothers me, frankly, because it seems to me like what we may see is some sort of short-term armistice. I've always said on the show many times, that's what I see happening. It's sort of like Korea. You'll end up with sort of a border, probably along the lines of where the fighting is right now. And that will be it for a year, maybe 2 years, however long it takes for Russia to regroup. But that, Carl, it seems to me there is a danger that we are really doing damage to sort of the international norms. I know that people don't like to talk about international norms, but we did have them for a while.
I can see the comments coming through already, Andy.
Yeah,
right. That's Andy. You're talking to me. You're not talking to J.D. Vance, so you're on safer ground. But the analogy with Korea is interesting. You've mentioned that before. I've been thinking about that. But there's been U.S. troops there since 1950, and that's a long time. And I don't. What J.D. Vance is saying is he doesn't want, and what the president has said, and Trump's been saying this for a long time, that we don't want American troops there. We don't want them there to have to enforce the armistice. This is why, and I'm inferring a lot of this because the President Trump he's sort of vacillated between being incoherent and dishonest. But what comes out is he has an idea, I think, and his idea is that the United States will invest in that country. There will be American companies there. They'll be doing work. It'll be an international force. There will be reasons for Vladimir Putin and Russia to honor this agreement, that he'll get some territorial concessions, and that there won't be any reason to go in again. That'd be great, but I'm skeptical of it. And remember, when this war started, the Europeans, and Europeans are still saying this, particularly in the, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these countries, Moldova, that this was just the beginning, that Putin wanted to swallow Ukraine. He marched in there thinking Kiev, the government would fall in 3 days. And that didn't happen. And these other countries, including Poland, have been invaded by Russia, have been taken over by Russia for generations. So this idea that we're only talking about Ukraine, but one of the original rationales for the Europe being so concerned and the United States being concerned wasn't just Ukraine. Not that Ukraine's not important, but that there were that you'd have this destabilization. President Trump hasn't addressed those concerns, and neither has this administration. But at some point, Marco Rubio talked about this before he was Secretary of State. So we're going to have to see where the administration comes out on this concern.
Yeah. Well, Tom, one of the things that Trump did talk about was having European troops sort of be there to sort of peacekeeping forces. Russia has already pushed back on that and said, no, we haven't agreed to that. But that does seem to be sort of at least on paper, sort of a viable idea that you would have the Europeans who have these huge economies, troops and whatnot, and have them take the role, as Carl was saying, that we took in Korea, and enforcing the peace. The question, I guess, is whether when push comes to shove, will the Europeans hold up to that if in a year or two Russia decides it's time to try again, which right. I have no doubt that they would be a contingency plan in what they're talking about. They are not talking about sort of like, okay, we did this, didn't work out so well, so we're just going to sort of like take a half a loaf here. Vladimir Putin isn't a half a loaf kind of guy.
Well, maybe. I mean, maybe not. I mean, I think it's too early to prejudge and say. I know, Carl, this was the argument, right? That, Putin's going to march all the way through Eastern Europe and swallow up all these countries. And I don't know that I ever believed that necessarally.
Well, Tom, he talked about it. He talked about it himself, reconstituting the Soviet Union. This wasn't somebody's fear. Mike McFaul just didn't make this up out of whole cloth. Putin talks this way about reassembling the Soviet empire. So it was legitimate fear. Still is, right?
Perhaps. But look, I do think, one of the things that Trump did in his first term, complained about, tried to move the needle and move the ball, is getting Europeans to contribute more to NATO, to the NATO alliance, particularly as it regards Europe's defense, that
he
shouldering a huge burden.
They have matched us dollar for dollar in Ukraine, and all these countries have increased their share of NATO expenditure.
Right. He has succeeded in that. And now we're hearing, Keir Starmer of the UK had talked about British peacekeeping forces going into Ukraine. Other countries have sort of broached the subject. And so Europe is moving in that direction. I think that actually would be a good outcome, to have them shoulder most of the burden. Not to say, we can't shoulder any of it, but if it ends in a lasting peace that stops the war, stops the killing, that's going to be a good thing, and that's the ultimate goal here.
So there's just one other aspect of this I want to touch on, and that's the nuclear aspect of it. I mean, Ukraine famously gave away their nuclear weapons, thinking they had a security guarantee from both Russia and the United States. Whether they could have ever actually used those weapons, who knows? But nuclear deterrence is an untested idea. We don't know what really happens when you push the button. So it seems to me that they had essential nuclear deterrence, and they gave that away. Now, if I'm Poland, I'm Taiwan, I'm Japan, I'm looking at this, I'm South Korea, I'm looking at this thinking, maybe nuclear weapons are a good thing to have. Maybe I need them if this is the way the U.S. and my erstwhile allies are going to treat me. And Tom, does it raise the possibility that we're going to see sort of nuclear proliferation? Because in this sort of world that we're entering, everyone's on their own, and you need to roll your own, and you need to have a couple nukes in your back pocket.
You need to roll your own. That is a Caribbean reference if I've ever heard one, Andy.
I have been
In
down
case
in the
anyone,
Caribbean
in case
for a
anyone
couple of
wonders
weeks,
where
yes.
Andy's been for the last month, uh, down there rolling his own. Listen, it's again, is it possible that it could spur some sort of nuclear arms race? Yeah, I suppose it's possible. As Carl said, I mean, there are countries in Eastern Europe that have legitimate concerns. And, one of Russia's original concerns was the expansion of NATO, which, we can go into that. That's a lot of the backstory here that was a pretext for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, but I just don't know that that's, again, is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Is it likely? I don't know how likely it is. I mean, that all these countries are going to suddenly decide we have to have nuclear weapons to be a deterrence against
Well,
Russia.
Tom, this is on the table though, because Putin himself has used all this loose talk about he's scared people by invoking this. But I'll say one other thing though, Andy, nuclear weapons aside, none of these countries want to fight Russia in a conventional war either. Remember when that guy, this mercenary that Putin had working for him, Wagner, supposedly was marching on Kremlin, and all the talking heads on the cable, oh, this is it for Putin. I didn't worry that 9,000 mercenaries were going to conquer Russia, because Adolf Hitler sent 40 divisions of the great, well-trained troops in that country, and most of them were killed. He slaughtered them. The Russians slaughtered them. Napoleon found out the same thing. Even in these countries don't even want to fight a conventional war with Russia, and that's why if President Trump can get, he's going to have to get assurances from Vladimir Putin that Putin has to make publicly, or people are still going to be worried.
Yeah, well, I mean, to that point, it'd be a very different situation on the ground in Ukraine if you could magically wave a wand and get rid of Russia's nuclear capability. Because without their nukes, that army ain't all what it's cracked up to be. No matter what
that's what we keep saying.
100 years ago, yeah,
they've never lost a war. Napoleon couldn't conquer them.
Right. Well, for that, thank you for that history.
I bring up
lesson,
Napoleon
Carl.
because Trump's compared himself to Napoleon.
I know. All right. I want to talk about a few political stories outside of Washington, in Ohio and in New York State. Let's start with Vivek Ramaswamy. He announced he is going to run for the governor of Ohio. It's not a surprise. He was endorsed by Trump on Sunday night. So, Tom, what do you make of Ramaswamy's bid, and what are his chances of winning the GOP nomination?
I think they're good. I think, especially with Trump's endorsement. And again, this was part of and we talked about this, he was supposed to be part of Doge with Elon Musk. He might be sort of happy that he's not, that he got eased out, and he's not embroiled in this,
He's not being hung in effigy all
what is getting to be more and more contentious, almost seemingly by the day. So he exited, or was pushed out, seemed like, if you were reading the tea leaves, and decided he was going to go run for governor of Ohio. And he made his announcement yesterday. But he did say, look, it was very doji, his announcement, that he was going to bring those same principles to the great state of Ohio. And he talked a lot about energy and unleashing prosperity and all of those things. Look, the thing about Vivek is, he's clearly a very talented politician, and he does a very good job. And he acquitted himself well on the stump when he was talking to voters. He would have these exchanges with voters, very civil. He'd listen to them, and oftentimes they'd agree to disagree, but it was really a sort of nice civil conversation. The problem is that he's often comes across as how do I put this?
Arrogant.
Yeah, that's a good. I was actually going to use a harsher phrase, but yeah, he's not always the most likable guy. People think he's intelligent, but you remember on his stage, I thought Nikki Haley was going to try and strangle him a couple times. Chris Christie ripped him a few times. I mean, there were plenty of Republicans who ran against him who simply did not like him, and it was very personal, and you could see that. And so the question is, is he going to generate those same kinds of emotions among his challengers in this race in Ohio? Is he going to be sort of expand his likability enough to not only win a Republican primary, but win a general election? I think he probably can, given that Ohio is as red as it's become. But that's something to definitely keep an eye on.
Well, you would have thought he would have no chance at all and was utterly unqualified for a job be governor of Iowa. He never was active in Republican politics. He's never run anything but this one company. But he ran for president. So now it seems, oh yeah, governor. And if people are used to the idea that he was running for president, they're not going to look at it that way. Look, we've had these three young people who ran for president, had no business running for president. Pete Buttigieg, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Andrew Yang. Now, Andrew Yang's off trying to start a third party. Vivek wants to be governor of Ohio, which is where he grew up. The rumors are that Mayor Pete wants to go to Michigan and run for governor or Senate there. So these are ambitious young guys, these Ivy School types that they think they should run the world, not pay any dues, not learn anything. This is the problem with Doge, But what it comes down to is what Tom's talking about. Voters are open-minded. They're more open-minded than I am about these kinds of things. And Tom will remember this. We went to the Harley Davidson Museum in Milwaukee before the convention or before the debate. There was a Republican debate there. I can't remember when it was. And we saw this old couple, bikers, white beards. If they had had Hell's Angels jackets, it wouldn't have surprised you. But they didn't. They had Vivek Ramaswamy swag on, T-shirts and stuff. And that made me realize populists out there are looking for fresh thinking, fresh voices. And you can paint outside the lines now in American politics. So I wouldn't rule it out.
I will say, notwithstanding Carl's anti-Jacksonian
I thought I just gave a very Jacksonian.
Well, you did, but I mean,
sentiment.
The first part is, Carl thinks none of these people are qualified to run for president. And yet the three people that he mentioned all acquitted themselves pretty well on the campaign trail. I mean, Pete Buttigieg, I remember going out and watching him campaign in Iowa, and he was speaking to voters in a way that other Democrats in that primary were not. And that's why he did, I think, as well as he did. I think it's a good thing that you have people in the process who aren't career politicians, who haven't served for 50 years like Joe Biden in the Senate. I mean, how'd that work out? It's good to have young people from different backgrounds and disciplines getting into the political arena. Now, whether they're qualified to be, run like the Department of Transportation or something is a different story. But they certainly have all acquitted themselves well and proved that they were good communicators. And that's kind of what the job is about. And so I expect we'll see that trend continue.
Well, I want to switch to New York here for a second because something's going on there. Not a new name. It's an old name under it's former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who has reported he may enter the mayor's race for New York City. He's already getting endorsements. People may remember Andrew Cuomo. He resigned back in 2021 amid these sexual misconduct allegations and problems he had with nursing homes and COVID. We will all remember that stuff. The primary is June 24th, Tom. Do you think Cuomo will run? And if he does, is he the lead? There's about 7 people in the race right now.
Don't sleep on Anthony Weiner. The comeback is on. I saw something the other day where he was talking about.
I would not sleep on Anthony
getting back in. Exactly.
That is a great metaphor.
Cuomo versus
That's
Weiner.
a good headline.
Look, Andrew Cuomo, his. Do you remember when COVID started and he was doing these daily press conferences, basically dueling with Trump? Trump was doing it at the White House, and Andrew Cuomo had his PowerPoints up there and was going through all this stuff. And everyone, I mean, the left absolutely loved him. Oh, this was so great. He's dealing in facts. Trump's dealing in fantasy. And this is what a leader looks like. And, we ran into this whole thing with his brother, Chris, and obviously the stuff that went on with the nursing homes, the absolute travesty of that policy and the tragedy that resulted from it, all these thousands and thousands of people that died alone in these nursing homes.
And because they were forced there by the governor.
Exactly. By his policies.
Yeah.
And then the sexual misconduct stuff was kind of the final nail. But again, there are second acts in American life. We've seen this over and over again. So is it possible he could, and he certainly still has high name recognition, which is not unimportant when you're dealing in politics. And he still has, even though he may have left in disgrace, his father is still revered in New York.
Well, that's what I wonder,
by
Tom.
most Democrats.
I wonder how many, every year that goes by, fewer and fewer voters, especially young voters, even remember Mario Cuomo. And that's my question, is the one you raised, whether the Cuomo name still has that power in New York. I'll tell you this, just looking at the race from outside, I'm not an expert in New York politics, but you have a governor there, excuse me, a mayor who is running, and
Right.
Eric Adams, and despite his troubles with the law and his troubles with Trump and immigration, all this bad press he's gotten, the more candidates in it, I think the more it helps Eric Adams. I think the larger the field.
That's true, but I also think that helps Cuomo because the name recognition is so high, and this, the time between his announcement, which people say could come in the next couple of days, and the primary, which is basically the election, that's in June 24th. It's not that long.
Right.
So to sort of, if he gets the kinds of endorsements that it looks like he's sort of lining up, I think goes in as sort of the favored candidate. I don't know if Eric Adams can survive this. And if he doesn't survive this, I wonder how he's looking at that deal he made with the Justice.
You mean they'll bring back the indictment? This
why not? Well, they've said
it's interesting.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, typically,
go ahead.
Endorsements don't mean much in these. We see the editorial boards and all these things, but in circumstances like this, where you have a candidate who has left office in disgrace, getting an endorsement and getting the sort of credibility and cover that he may be able to get from some fellow elected politicians might give voters enough cover to vote for him again.
Well, I bet he doesn't get Letitia.
So I think it might actually matter this time. Probably not.
Carl, Rachel Maddow, she is not pleased that MSNBC is parting ways with Joy Reid. She said on her program on Monday night, it was, quote, unnerving that the network was removing both of their non-white primetime hosts. What do you make of what's going on in MSNBC? This is part of a larger reorganization, of course.
Well, normally calling your boss racists wouldn't be a good move, but it worked for Kamala Harris. She called Joe Biden a racist, and he made her vice president. So the old rules are probably out the window. Rachel Maddow was clearly upset. She seems very close to Joy Reid, or at least she said she was. She did not mention, and she mentioned all these changes that are going on. Now there's a restructuring going on. That whole network's been spin off, and she was talking about people like producers and camera people, and she seemed genuinely concerned about the network. There were two issues that I noticed she didn't touch on. One was the ratings. Joy Reid's ratings, as Tom pointed out yesterday, were very poor and getting worse. And she didn't point out her own salary, Rachel Maddow's salary, which could pay for several dozen producers. So she didn't, but she vented and emoted, which is really her stock in trade. She wears her emotions on her sleeve. I have no reason to think that she's not sincere, and she told people how she felt.
Yeah. Well, so Tom, this, Reid's, she had the 7 p.m. show, and then Reid did this TikTok or something yesterday. She cried on the camera about being canceled. But the new show, or what's replacing her, at least for the time being, it's Michael Steele, it's Simone Sanders Townsend, and Alicia Menendez. Menendez will be the first Latina to host a primetime MSNBC show. So if you're counting things like that, there's something to celebrate. What do you think?
Right. I mean, that's all of these cries that this was somehow a racist purge by the MSNBC brass. Keith Olbermann's been saying it, and others. I mean, it's just absurd. And that's what Rachel Maddow intimated last night when she said that it was indefensible that they would fire their two non-white primetime hosts. She said it's indefensible, and I will not defend it. Well, okay.
Is Michael Steele still black, Tom?
As far as I know, he is. And Simone Sanders is also black and very progressive. And as you mentioned, Alicia Menendez, she's a minority as well. So in some ways, they got rid of 2 primetime non-white hosts and replaced them with 3 new non-primetime hosts. And that's only on one show. I don't know who's going to be on the other show. So look, I think all of this stuff, obviously, Rachel Maddow was close to Joy Reid, didn't want to see her go. And the other thing, too, is she's not being reassigned. She's leaving the network altogether. And so
Right.
she and Rachel aren't going to be able to have their, election night powwows where they're, they got 12 people on set and they're sitting next to each other and either, in uh, ecstasy or agony, depending on which year it was and what the outcome of the election was.
Well, all of this is happening against this context, this larger context, which is the spinoff by Comcast, which owns MSNBC, of most of its cable networks. So there's a big business story here behind all this. And the reason they're spinning them off and they're putting them in a new company is actually called SpinCo, which is, I think, a great name for a sort of a cable a conglomeration of cable.
It's like truth in advertising.
Exactly. So MSNBC is going there. CNBC will be in there. A bunch of others. And the reason is that the cable industry has changed so much that these middle tier and lower tier cable networks are now considered at best to be cash cows. And at worst, they're sort of aging assets that you want to slough off and get off your books because consumers are, as everyone knows, are moving away from cable to digital streaming. So MSNBC makes money in two ways. People should understand. They make money on your cable bill, and they make money on advertising. That's basically it. And they're being hit on both revenue fronts right now. The cable carriage contracts are incredibly tough negotiations between the cable companies and the satellite companies and the networks that actually own the wires that go into your house. Those are really tough negotiations, and those were always based on sort of bundling these cable networks into a package where if you wanted to take, and Fox is a great example of this, if you wanted Fox News, you had to take Fox Business. And that's how Fox Business got introduced into 60, 70, 80 million cable households. When you spin them off, there's a real question of whether or not those cable contracts, when they're renegotiation, whether they get carriage at all or whether the carriage per household numbers will be cut. Advertising, as you guys know, is driven entirely by audience numbers, and if your audience numbers are down, that's a problem. So there's a real question, I think, of whether or not MSNBC and CNBC are viable as independent companies unless they change not just their lineup, but also their entire strategy and sort of embrace digital platforms and that sort of thing. But at any rate, it's a very tough go. And I think that
also, Andy,
go ahead.
It doesn't help if you're paying $20 million contracts to anchors. That's not,
yes,
under this new model, it's probably not sustainable.
Yeah.
So but one thing, as I hear you talk, really, you, Tom, and I should put together a syndicate and buy the Golf Channel, because that's the people who watch that are so old, they're not cord cutters.
Right.
And it will continue to be profitable as long as we'll be working. So if you're an investor and you're listening to this show, call Tom, Andy, or I. We'll buy. We'll buy that. That's one of the things that they're spinning off, the Golf Channel. I think
exactly that's part of SpinCo. So there you have it. But Tom, you're a savvy observer of media in general. What do you think that the future of MSNBC looks like? Or does somebody buy it, cut the costs, and turn it into something that's more viable?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting, for all the reasons that you mentioned. I mean, the business itself is incredibly tough, and then being spun off, I think there is real worry inside the network, and that's part of the reason they started this shakeup. I'm sure there will be more coming because they can't continue to exist in an environment where again, Joy Reid, we mentioned this yesterday, 59,000 people watching during from that coveted demo, the 25 to 54-year-old audience. That's not going to cut it for MSNBC, particularly as Carl mentions. It's a big network. They've got a lot of overhead at that network, and that's just unsustainable. And so I think there is real concern, not just at MSNBC, but at a lot of these companies. And they're going to have to figure it out, because if they don't, they're going to go out of business. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just the reality of the situation.
Well, one idea would be to get a bunch of great podcast programs, assemble them into a new network, and put it on MSNBC. Cut your costs, and be digital from day one. Anyway,
We'll
just an
take
idea.
1/10 of Rachel Maddow's salary.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I wanted to switch gears. I want to talk about Kristi Noem for a second. She announced Monday, she's of course the new DHS secretary. She announced on Monday evening that her agency had identified some individuals that she says gave or leaked rather information, internal information, including details about an oncoming ICE raid in Los Angeles. This is what she said. She said, quote, "I have found some leakers. We are continuing to get more. They will be fired. There will be consequences." She went on to say, when they leak information in the press in order to blow an operation, they're putting law enforcement lives in jeopardy. Carl, what do you make of this? And is this the kind of thing that that A, is it actually happening, and B, what do you do about it? Because it is a problem.
She didn't name names, and I've been the beneficiary of government leaks, but not like this. This is an operation where, theoretically, at least, now this didn't happen, but you're putting lives in danger, law enforcement lives in danger. And if this really happened and she has proof of it, not only will these people be fired, my guess is some of them will be charged criminally if this happened the way she implied.
I mean, it's a good thing, I think, if that's exactly what happened, as Carl mentioned. And she said she was using polygraphs tests, and she was allowed to do that because it's a national.
She is, but they're inadmissible in a criminal court, but they're not inadmissible for personnel
in terms
decisions.
of, yeah. So look, the leaking situation, you remember during the first Trump administration, I mean, the government was leaking like a sieve. All these agencies and all these bureaucrats that were opposed to Trump, and the FBI and the CIA, and they were leaking his phone calls to foreign leaders. And I mean, it was out of control. That's a problem. It's a problem on a number of levels. I suppose if you opposed President Trump, you thought it was great and you wanted to see more of it. But there are national security concerns, and we don't want our government to be leaking these kinds of details to the press, particularly when there could be lives put at risk. And that's something that I think, look, most media organizations, generally speaking, they withhold details of military operations all the time. If the president's going on a secret trip, they withhold that stuff. But for some reason, because it's immigration, because it's ICE, I guess, because the recipients are folks who are, officials in these sanctuary cities, they think that this is somehow a moral good that they're doing, when in fact they could actually be putting people's lives in danger.
Yeah. Well, the other Kristi Noem story, she announced over the weekend, I think, that encounters at the southern border had hit a record 15-year low on Saturday. And she said this, she said, on Saturday, CPB encountered just 200 aliens at the southern border, lowest single apprehension day in over 15 years. So, Carl, it does raise the question, was this easier to do than people sort of thought?
Maybe, but you don't have to be a math major to realize the time frame she had in mind encompassed Donald Trump's first term as well. So,
well, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But still, a pretty dramatic turnaround.
That's right. And the Democrats, and this is just my opinion, but they made a mistake and both parties do this. I mentioned this the other day on this show. They disliked Trump so much that anything he was doing, they wanted to turn around. And Trump had come up with, and he'd had some false starts. And he had that crazy rap about he's going to build the wall. Mexico's going to pay for it, which he said like 500 times. But by the end of Donald Trump's first term in office, they had this Remain in Mexico plan in place where people were these refugee, because some people really are qualified for refugee status. A lot of them don't, and just use that language. And he had a program that was working. And the Biden administration, I think, made a mistake in just getting rid of it and trashing it. And I think a lot of Democrats came to that conclusion too, including Joe Biden, who kind of rescinded some of his orders with 6 months to go in his term, but it was too late.
Yeah. Tom, you got about a minute left here. What do you make of the new numbers?
I mean, it was way easier to do that. This was the great lie of the Biden administration. They threw open the doors of the border on day one. He rescinded all of those orders, executive orders that Trump had put in place. And then they went straight to the American public and lied about it. Said, no, the border's secure. It's not a problem. No issue. No crisis. When we saw with our own eyes, people started streaming across the border, and we had record numbers for 4 years. It's one of the reasons Trump got elected. It's one of the main campaign promises that he made, that he was going to shut it down. And we're 30 days in, and he shut it down. His administration. It's a matter of priorities and emphasis
Mhm.
and symbolism. And guess what? It's not that hard. If you have the political will to do it, you can get it done.
All right. Well, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. But don't go away. Carl will be back after this.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics, talking now with Liana Fix, who is an expert on German politics. She's a fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. I first became aware of her work when she was with the German Marshall Fund, and she also teaches at Georgetown. And so we've had these very interesting and elections in Germany, and I think that they affect the whole world order in Ukraine and Russia, United States. But that's an impression I have. Lana, you're going to set me straight. All right, let's just start with the beginning. So what happened in these elections?
So these elections were elections in which the German voters basically punished the progressive center-left coalition that was the first post-Merkel government after her 16 years in power, and ended in chaos, to keep it short. Something which is unusual for Germans. Germans don't like early elections, they don't like chaos, they do like stability, which is why they voted for Friedrich Merz, the successor and also arch enemy of Angela Merkel, who is now leading the Conservative Party in Germany with around 28% with the election outcome. And he is lucky enough that he can possibly form a two-party coalition, which is much more stable than the chaotic three-party progressive coalition that I just mentioned, with the Social Democrats, which will give him a slim majority, but enough to govern the country.
Let me ask you a question about that, because this populist party that we're taught, the mainstream media here, the liberal establishment here and in Europe, they don't want to say their name, but they came in second place, and they're ascendant, especially in East Germany, as I understand, especially among working class people. So there's some echoes of, the populist movement in other countries, including our own. Will shutting these people out of the coalition only make them stronger? Is there a risk there?
The thinking in Germany goes differently. First of all, the AfD, this right-wing radical populist party in Germany, they have doubled the election results, so they're now at more than 20%, which is huge. But they are one of the most radical right-wing parties in Europe. Many other right-wing parties in Europe are trying to appear more normalized, to move to the center, to make themselves coalition partners. The AfD does not. The AfD has radicalized over the last 12 years of its existence. And for Germans, the historical lesson from the Weimar Republic, the first attempt of German democracy in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, the lessons that Germans draw from that period is you can't tame the extremists by taking them into a coalition, because that's what they tried exactly with the NSDAP and with Adolf Hitler at that time, and it didn't work. It brought the radicals to power. That's where Germany had this firewall against working with the AfD. The only problem is this time the AfD might be at 20%. Next time, if things go really badly, they might be at 30%. And then it's almost impossible to keep them out of government. That's what Friedrich Merz has vowed that he will prevent. He wants to cut the AfD's figures by focusing on immigration and the economy, and to prevent the destruction of the Conservative Party in Germany.
So, in our country, a rough example would be, Bernie Sanders. So he runs for president. He's on these economic issues really too far left for mainstream Democrats, or slightly more than half mainstream Democrats, because he got a lot of votes and won a lot of delegates. But then, he won by losing. A lot of his program became incorporated into Democratic Party politics here in the United States. And I'm wondering, will this populist party, with their harsh stance on immigration, in order to forestall them getting 30% next time, in order to keep this coalition together, will the two mainstream parties that will be running Germany, will they have to address the concerns people have about immigration and crime?
They will, but since the Social Democrats are a center-left party and the conservatives under Friedrich Merz have moved much further to the right than Angela Merkel has positioned the party, it is quite difficult to find concessions there. And there's an extra caveat, and that is that Friedrich Merz has voted together with the AfD, or has accepted votes from the AfD in an anti-asylum motion just a couple of weeks before the elections, which was a taboo in German politics before. He broke a taboo. So there are real concerns that he's not serious about upholding the firewall in the Social Democratic Party, which again will make it really difficult for these two parties to come together on energy and on migration. And also, the Social Democrats know that they are the chosen partner for Friedrich Merz and the Conservatives, and that he basically has no alternative. So what they do right now is saying, well, thanks for inviting us. We'll think about it. We'll sleep about it. Let's see, right? They're trying to extract concessions. And if there's one thing that German elections and coalition negotiations are certain to lead to, it just takes time. German coalition negotiations take forever, and now the deadline of before Easter is even considered to be an optimistic deadline.
All right, I want to get to Vladimir Putin and then to J.D. Vance, two very different characters. If you're Vladimir Putin, you're sitting in the Kremlin, you see these elections in Germany, what's your reaction? How do you think this helps you or hurts you?
So Friedrich Merz is more hawkish on Ukraine than the Social Democrats have been. He's quite strong on security and defense, but from the Kremlin's perspective, the hope may be, well, we are just patient and let's see how the AfD performs in the next elections. The Kremlin might also look at the rise of left-wing parties in the German parliament, which are not necessarily big by themselves, but once they jump over the 5% threshold that you have in the German parliament, they just make it very complicated for others to form a coalition because they eat into the share of the other parties, right? That's where the German political system gets complicated.
Well, let me ask you, when you say left-wing parties, because these divisions, they change over time. Those left-wing parties in Germany, they're not necessarily like the pro-Soviet parties because the Soviet Union's gone. So where are they on Russia, the left-wing parties in Germany?
Well, surprisingly, the left-wing parties are quite pro-Russian. Not only because they had in the past a stronghold in Eastern Germany, which is traditionally more Russia-friendly than Western Germany, surprisingly, because they were with the GDR, Soviet satellite. But also because from their perspective, they have always been critical of the United States and of NATO. They consider the United States and NATO as the greater evil, imperialism, US imperialism, and so on, which made them softer on Russia and Russia's policies. And right now, they do not necessarily speak out in favor of Vladimir Putin, but they do speak out in favor of ending the war in Ukraine, not necessarily in Ukraine's favor. So they look at what Donald Trump is doing actually with delight, because they think, well, it's actually not too different from what we've advocated, although we have a left-wing populists.
So politics does make strange bedfellows. Left-wing German politicians and activists sort of leaning towards Donald Trump. All right, that leads me naturally to J.D. Vance. So he came to Munich. He got very bad reviews among liberals in this country and liberals in Europe too. But there was one thing I want to that he said. There's one thing I want to ask you about, because I won't lie to you, I'm very sympathetic on this one point to what Vance was saying, Liana, and it's the censorship in Europe, in England, France, Germany. But he was talking specifically on German soil, mostly to Germans. And CBS 60 Minutes ran a story here. I'm sure you saw it about the speech police in Germany, and it gave me chills. And I thought that Vance was making a valid point, not just to an American audience. And I was thinking, if I was European, I'd feel the same way. I mean, freedom of speech is is a cherished value. And I'm wondering, under the guise of political correctness or being kind to immigrants, or, for well-meaning reasons, these European governments, especially Germany, have gotten away from it in a way that's dangerous to them. So I was sympathetic to that argument. Tell me what you thought.
There is actually between, let's say, more center-right newspapers in Germany or commentators in Germany or center left, that there's actually debate about these issues, how much people be punished for saying you are a bad person on X, to what extent is that really punishable? I think in J.D. Vance's speech, the problem is that he used these examples, and some of them were not even correct, to make a broader point of saying there should be no firewalls in German in politics in general. So he implicitly advocated for being more open to the AfD, and I think that's what really made everyone in Germany upset, because I think was, well, this is entirely our choice what we are going to do with the AfD, and that it's not for the United States to decide. On the freedom of speech issue, I think it's also important to keep in mind that freedom of speech in the US is interpreted in a much broader way than it is in Germany and in Europe in general, where the basic principle of the German constitution is not the freedom of speech, as it is in the United States, but the basic principle upon which the German basic law rests is the dignity of the human being, Menschenwürde, dignity of the humans, right? And so if you put that into the center, the definition of what is acceptable freedom of speech and what is hate speech, it's much narrower in Germany and in Europe traditionally and culturally than it is in the United States. So there's definitely a divide, and there is a healthy debate on that in Germany and Europe, but many perceive this as as a bold message from J.D. Vance, who is at least ambiguous on U.S. politics and the question to what extent the last elections were conducted correctly, whether Joe Biden was a legitimate president or not. That was the pushback in Germany and in Europe.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for us today. My guest has been Liana Fix, an expert in German politics. We've been talking about these elections, that the message reverberated beyond German borders, and because we're all one world here. So on that note, I'll leave you. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time, 3 p.m. in the West, 6 p.m. here in the East. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM Radio.